The steam engine hissed like a dying beast against the wooden platform of the Missoula depot. Caleb Sterling, a man carved from the unforgiving granite of the Bitterroot Mountains, stood waiting for a quiet, God-fearing woman to share his isolated cabin. He expected calloused hands and a lowered gaze. Instead, through the rolling white smoke stepped a woman, clutching a velvet carpet bag, as if it held her very soul. She smelled of expensive lavender and fresh gunpowder. In that single breathless moment, Caleb didn't know it, but the simple life he craved was over. He was about to catch a hurricane. The year was 1884, and the Montana Territory was no place for a man who needed soft things. Caleb Sterling had spent the last decade trapping beaver, hunting elk, and pulling just enough gold out of a freezing creek to buy salt coffee and ammunition. He was 34, with a beard the color of winter bark and eyes like chipped flint. The solitude of the Bitterroots had been his sanctuary after the brutal, bloody years he spent as a scout in the plains. But the silence of his mountain cabin had recently turned from a comfort into a crushing weight. He didn't want a grand romance. He wanted a partner, someone to tend the hearth when he was checking trap lines, someone to speak to when the winter snows locked the world away for months at a time. He had written to the Hearth and Home Matrimonial Agency in St. Louis requesting a pragmatic widow or a sturdy farm girl. The letters that returned were signed by a Martha Higgins, a woman who claimed she could mend a fence dress, a buck, and asked for nothing more than a safe roof and a respectful husband. Caleb had sent her the train fare, expecting a hardened woman of the soil. As the Northern Pacific locomotive groaned to a halt, belching black soot into the crisp autumn air, Caleb stood by his wagon, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt. The passengers spilled out, prospectors, gamblers, and cattlemen. And then she appeared. She was not Martha Higgins, or at least she was nothing like the woman in the letters. She descended the iron steps of the railcar with a precarious grace, hindered by a heavy wool coat that was clearly 2 sizes too large, attempting to conceal a dress of torn dark blue silk. Her hair, the color of crushed chestnuts, was hastily pinned up, escaping in wild tendrils around a face that was strikingly beautiful, but pale, with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Her eyes, a sharp, piercing green, darted frantically across the depot, scanning the faces of the rough men on the platform like a hunted animal calculating its last escape route. Caleb stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. Martha. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the hiss of the train. She flinched, her grip tightening so fiercely on a heavy dark green velvet carpet bag that her knuckles turned white. She looked at him, taking in his towering height, the broad shoulders draped in a canvas duster, and the Colt single-action revolver strapped to his thigh. She swallowed hard, forcing a tight, trembling smile. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was not the flat, practical drawl of a Missouri farm girl. It carried the polished, rhythmic cadence of East Coast high society, though it was frayed at the edges with sheer panic. I am she." Caleb's eyes narrowed. He looked at her uncalloused, delicate hands, devoid of any sun damage or hard labor. He looked at the mud caked on the hem of her expensive silk dress. "You wrote that you grew up plowing fields in Colombia." "I adapted." She lied, the tremor in her voice betraying her. Caleb knew a liar when he saw one. He had survived the frontier by reading the truths men tried to hide. But standing there in the Missoula mud, surrounded by the chaos of the boomtown, he saw something else in her eyes. terror. A desperate, clawing terror. Whoever she was and whatever she was running from, sending her back on the next train eastward, looked like it would be a death sentence. "The wagon's this way," Caleb said, finally turning his back to her. It was a calculated test. If she was a spoiled rich girl looking for a thrill, she'd complain about the mud or the lack of a porter. She didn't say a word. She practically ran to keep up with his long strides, tossing her velvet bag into the bed of the wagon with a heavy metallic thud that did not sound like clothes or blankets. Caleb hoisted her up onto the wooden bench seat. As she sat, her coat parted slightly, and Caleb caught the undeniable metallic glint of a silver-plated derringer tucked securely into the waistband of her skirt. A farm girl from Missouri, indeed. Caleb clicked his tongue, slapping the reins against the backs of his two draft horses. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the noise of Missoula behind. They rode in absolute silence for the first 3 hours. The road turned from a muddy thoroughfare into a rocky, treacherous trail winding upward into the foothills. The air grew colder, biting at their faces. "If we're going to share a roof, ma'am," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, "I reckon I ought to know the name of the woman I'm actually marrying." She stiffened beside him. For a long moment, the only sound was the grinding of the wagon wheels over loose shale and the rushing of a nearby creek. "Josephine," she whispered the wind, nearly carrying the name away. "My name is Josephine Cartwright." Caleb nodded slowly. "Well, Josephine, I don't know what kind of storm you brought with you on that train, but in my mountains you carry your own weight, and you don't lie. Can you do that?" "I can," she said, her chin lifting with a sudden fierce defiance. "Good," Caleb replied, glancing back at the velvet bag. "Because where we're going, the wolves don't care about your secrets. They only care if you're slow." The journey to Caleb's homestead was a grueling 2-day ascent into the jagged teeth of the bitterroots. By the time they reached the halfway point, the wagon could go no further. Caleb transferred their supplies and Josephine's heavy velvet bag onto the backs of 2 sturdy mules. Josephine was given a dappled grey mare to ride. The illusion of the stoic, capable pioneer woman shattered within the first hour on horseback. Josephine was clearly unaccustomed to riding astride her silk dress, offering no protection against the biting leather of the saddle. The temperature plummeted as they climbed higher into the alpine forests, the sky bruising into a violent shade of purple. An early September squall was rolling in, carrying the scent of pine and ice. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye. Her lips were blue, and she was shivering violently, but she clamped her jaw shut, refusing to utter a single word of complaint. Her resilience surprised him. Most city women he'd encountered would have been weeping demands to return to civilization by now. Josephine just kept her head down, her gloved hands gripping the reins, her eyes darting nervously at every snapping twig or howling gust of wind. She was acting less like a bride and more like a fugitive expecting a bullet in the back. As dusk fell, the snow began to come down in heavy, blinding sheets. Caleb cursed under his breath. "We push on for another mile," he shouted over the howling wind. "There's an old trapper's line shack up ahead. We'll ride out the storm there." When they finally pushed through the door of the dilapidated log shack, Josephine practically fell off her horse. Caleb caught her by the waist, surprised by how frail she felt beneath the heavy wool coat. He set her down inside, quickly, bringing the mules and the mare under the lean-to, out back. By the time Caleb returned to the interior of the shack, striking a match to light the small tin lantern and getting a fire going in the rusted iron stove, Josephine had collapsed onto a dusty wooden cot in the corner. She was desperately trying to open her velvet bag with frozen fingers. "Let me help you with that," Caleb said, stepping forward. "No!" She shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. She threw her body over the bag, her hand instinctively flying to her waist, where Caleb knew the derringer was hidden. Caleb stopped, dead in his tracks, his hands raised slowly. The flickering orange light of the fire cast long dancing shadows across the cramped room. "Miss Cartwright, I am not going to hurt you, but you are freezing to death, and I need to get a blanket out of your bag. There are no blankets in here." She breathed, her chest heaving. Before she could secure the brass clasp, her frozen fingers slipped. The heavy bag tipped off the edge of the cot and hit the floorboards, bursting open. Caleb stared. Spilling out across the dusty floor of the shack were not petticoats, lace, or family heirlooms. There were thick, tightly bound stacks of United States currency, thousands of dollars, in high-denomination greenbacks, and tumbling out alongside the money was a thick, black leather ledger, its pages edged in red. Josephine scrambled to her knees, frantically sweeping the money back into the bag. Her breathing was ragged, bordering on a sob. Caleb didn't move to help her. He simply stood by the stove, the heat radiating against his back, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "That's a lot of money for a farm girl from Colombia," he said quietly. She froze, her hands hovering over the black ledger. She looked up at him, the firelight reflecting the sheer, unadulterated desperation in her green eyes. She slowly reached into her coat and pulled out the silver derringer, pointing it directly at Caleb's chest. Her hand was shaking so badly the barrel rattled in the quiet air. "Step back, Mr. Sterling," she commanded, though her voice betrayed her terror. Caleb looked at the tiny gun, then back to her face. He didn't flinch. He didn't even drop his hands to his own revolver. "You've never fired a gun at a man before, have you, Josephine?" "I will if I have to." She lied again. "If you pull that trigger, one of two things will happen." Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm, like a slow-moving river under ice. "Either you miss and I take that toy away from you, or you hit me and I bleed out on this floor. And then you're entirely alone in a blizzard 40 miles from a town surrounded by grisly territory with a bag full of money you can't eat." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Put the gun down, Josie." The use of the nickname seemed to break something inside her. A tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the soot on her cheek. The derringer grew heavy in her hand. Slowly, the barrel dipped toward the floor. It slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the wood. She collapsed back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The fight had completely drained out of her. Caleb walked over, kicked the small pistol into the corner, and then knelt down. He picked up the black leather ledger. He didn't open it. He just held it out to her. "I don't care about the money," Caleb said gruffly, "but I care about the trouble that money brings to my door." "Who are you running from?" Josephine looked up, her face a portrait of ruin. "A man who owns half the railroads in Chicago," she whispered. "Arthur Pendleton. And the men he sends, they don't just kill you, Mr. Sterling. They erase you." The blizzard raged for 2 days, locking them inside the cramped 10 by 10 line shack. It was in that freezing, smoky darkness that Josephine laid her life bare. She wasn't a bride, and she wasn't a farm girl. Josephine Cartwright was the senior bookkeeper for the Pendleton Railway Corporation in Chicago. For years, she had been a loyal employee to Arthur Pendleton, an industrial tycoon who portrayed himself as a philanthropist. But 3 weeks ago, a misfiled document had led Josephine into the private archives. There she found the Black Ledger. It wasn't just bribery or embezzlement, Josephine told Caleb, staring blankly into the iron stove. It was blood. Pendleton wants to expand his rail lines through the Dakota and Montana territories, but the homesteaders wouldn't sell their land. So he hired men. Ex-military bounty hunters, thugs. He paid them to burn out the farmers, to slaughter their cattle. If the families didn't leave, he had them murdered. The ledger has every name, every date, every payment made to the killers. She had stolen the ledger to take to a federal judge. But Pendleton's men found out too quickly. They had cornered her in her apartment. She had escaped out a fire escape with nothing but the clothes on her back, the ledger, and the cash from the company safe she'd cleared out to fund her run. She needed to disappear. A matrimonial advertisement for a cabin in the middle of the absolute nowhere of the Bitterroot Mountains had seemed like the perfect hiding place until the heat died down. I used the name of my old maid Martha. She confessed, refusing to meet his eyes. I just needed a place to hide Mr. Sterling. I am sorry I deceived you. As soon as the snow clears, I will take my horse and leave. I won't bring this trouble to your door. Caleb remained silent for a long time, whittling a piece of pine with his hunting knife. The wood shavings curled onto the floor. The man Pendleton sends to find things, Caleb said finally. Does he have a name? Josephine shuddered. Clayton Briggs. They call him the Ghost Hound. He's a former Pinkerton. He tracked my brother down in Denver 3 years ago over a gambling debt. My brother was found at the bottom of a ravine, unrecognizable. Caleb stopped whittling. He looked at the fragile woman sitting across from him. She had brought a war to his sanctuary. The smart thing, the surviving thing, would be to put her on a mule and point her back to Missoula the second the sky cleared. He had come to these mountains to escape the violence of men. But as he looked at her, he saw the incredible grit it took for a city woman to steal from a tycoon, survive a cross-country train ride while being hunted, and brave a mountain blizzard. She had more iron in her spine than half the men he knew. We leave at first light, Caleb said, snapping his knife shut. To Missoula, she asked, her voice hollow with defeat. To my homestead, Caleb corrected. It's 10 miles higher up, built like a fortress. Missoula is crawling with Pinkertons and railroad men. You go back there, you're dead by Tuesday. A flicker of hope ignited in Josephine's eyes. Why are you helping me? I lied to you. I'm not a bride. Caleb stood up, tossing a fresh log into the stove. Because out here, a man is measured by what he protects. And Pendleton sounds like the kind of man who needs to learn that his money doesn't buy the mountains. 2 days later, they arrived at Caleb's cabin. It sat in a breathtaking alpine valley, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and a crystal-clear lake. The cabin itself was massive, built of thick, hand-hewn logs with heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. It was a beautiful, lonely fortress. Over the next 3 weeks, a strange domesticity settled over them. Josephine determined to prove she wasn't a burden, threw herself into the chores. The results were disastrous. She burned the sourdough bread into smoking bricks. She tried to pluck a pheasant and ended up covering the entire cabin in feathers while sobbing in frustration. She nearly burned the lean-to down, trying to render soap, but she never quit. Every morning she woke up at dawn bruised and exhausted and tried again. Caleb watched her with a mixture of amusement and deep growing respect. He stepped in quietly, gently showing her how to knead the dough without overworking it, how to hold the knife to dress the game, how to read the weather. By the way the smoke curled out of the chimney. In the evenings, they sat by the hearth. Caleb, a man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words a day for years, found himself telling her stories of his time on the plains, of the beauty of the Yellowstone caldera, of the peace he found in the quiet. Josephine, in turn, told him about the bustling streets of Chicago, the sound of the opera, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the winter. The cold, transactional contract of the mail-order bride faded away, replaced by a deep, unspoken bond forged in the isolation of the mountains. They were two outcasts learning to breathe the same air. It happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after she had arrived. Caleb had gone out to check his trap lines near the eastern ridge. Josephine was at the cabin, hanging wet laundry on a line strung between 2 pines. The sun was shining, a rare, warm autumn day. For the first time in months, she felt safe. She was humming a soft tune, pinning a linen shirt to the wire. Suddenly, the horses in the corral began to whinny wildly, kicking at the wooden fences. The mules stomped in a panic. Josephine stopped. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The wind shifted, carrying a metallic, coppery scent. She dropped the laundry basket and walked cautiously toward the edge of the tree line. There, nailed to the thick bark of a massive ponderosa pine, was a piece of parchment. Below it, lying in the dirt, was Caleb's favorite hunting hound, Buster. The dog's throat had been expertly, silently slit. Bile rose in Josephine's throat. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She ran to the tree, her hands trembling as she pulled the parchment from the nail. It was a page ripped out of a Chicago newspaper. On it was a sketched bounty poster of her face, and scrawled across her image in thick, dark blood were 3 words, "I found you." Clayton Briggs was in the valley. The war had arrived at Caleb Sterling's doorstep. Caleb emerged from the dense timberline an hour later, a brace of snowshoe hairs slung over his shoulder. He froze the moment he saw the dropped laundry basket. His eyes swept the clearing, tracing the frantic trampled mud in the corral, before finally landing on the massive ponderosa pine. He saw the parchment. He saw the blood. He dropped the hairs. He didn't run. Running invited panic, and Caleb Sterling had survived the frontier by maintaining a heart rate of ice. He walked with long, deliberate strides toward the tree. Josephine was sitting in the dirt a few yards away, her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. She was in shock, staring hollow-eyed at the lifeless body of Buster. Caleb knelt beside the hound. The cut was clean, professional. Buster hadn't even had time to bark. Caleb reached out his calloused hand, gently resting on the dog's head, smoothing the coarse fur between the ears. He stayed like that for a long, quiet minute. When he finally stood, the man who had patiently taught Josephine how to bake bread was gone. In his place stood the ghost of the plains, a man whose reputation was written in gunpowder and blood. He tore the bloody newspaper clipping from the bark, crumpled it into his fist, and walked over to Josephine. He hauled her to her feet by her upper arm. "Get inside," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a low, vibrating hum of absolute violence. "Bar the heavy shutters. Pull the iron latch on the back door. Do not light the stove, and do not light a lantern." "Caleb," Josephine stammered, her teeth chattering despite the autumn sun. "Briggs is here. We have to run. We have to saddle the horses, and there is no outrunning a Pinkerton tracker with a head start in this terrain." Caleb cut her off his grip, tightening just enough to ground her. "He killed my dog. He violated my land. He threatened my wife. Clayton Briggs isn't leaving this mountain." He practically shoved her toward the cabin, turning back only to grab a shovel from the lean-to. He buried Buster quickly, speaking a brief silent prayer over the fresh earth before striding into the cabin and barring the heavy oak door behind him. The interior was plunged into dim, dusty twilight, illuminated only by the thin shafts of sunlight piercing through the gun slits in the heavy wooden window shutters. Josephine stood in the center of the room, clutching her arms, watching in terrified awe as Caleb systematically dismantled the peaceful illusion of his home. He moved to the center rug, rolling it back to reveal a trapdoor seamlessly cut into the floorboards. He pulled it open and reached down into the dark cache. He hauled out a canvas roll, letting it drop onto the heavy oak dining table with a deafening metallic clatter. He unrolled it to reveal an arsenal, a pristine Winchester model, 1873 lever-action rifle, a heavy Sharps .50-90 Buffalo rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, and hundreds of brass cartridges gleaming in the dim light. "You told me you were just a trapper," Josephine whispered, her eyes wide, as Caleb began rapidly checking the action on the Winchester. "I told you I trap now." Caleb corrected, his eyes fixed on the breech of the rifle. "Before I came to this valley, I rode with General George Crook. I was a scout at the Battle of the Rosebud back in '76. I spent 5 years hunting men who did not want to be found across terrain worse than this. Briggs thinks he tracked a terrified city girl and her hapless dirt-farming husband. He has severely miscalculated. Oh, he grabbed a heavy leather bandolier and threw it over her head. It landed heavily across her shoulder, the weight of the brass bullets making her stagger. "I need you to listen to me, Josie," Caleb said, stepping close to her, his large hands gripping her shoulders. His gaze was intense, locking onto her panicked green eyes. "Briggs won't come alone. Pendleton's money buys posses. There will be at least 4 or 5 men out there in the timber waiting for nightfall. When the sun drops behind the ridge, they will try to rush the cabin. Your job is not to shoot. Your job is to stay low. Keep this Winchester loaded and pass it to me when the Sharps runs dry. Can you do that?" Josephine swallowed hard, her fingers tracing the cold brass of the cartridges on her chest. She remembered the terror in her Chicago apartment, the feeling of absolute helplessness. She looked at Caleb, at the sheer unyielding mountain of a man who was willing to die for a woman who had brought a war to his doorstep on a lie. She found her spine. "I can do it," she said, her voice steadying. "Good girl." The weight was worse than the violence. Hours crawled by. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, plunging the valley into a deep, freezing blackness. The wind picked up howling through the pines, a sound that masked the crunch of boots on dry needles. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. Caleb sat by the front window, slit the heavy barrel of the Sharp's rifle resting on the wood, his breathing slow and measured. Josephine sat on the floor beneath him, the loaded Winchester resting across her lap, her hands slick with nervous sweat. Then a voice echoed from the darkness, smooth, mocking, and loud enough to carry over the wind. Josephine Cartwright. The voice belonged to Clayton Briggs. It slithered through the logs of the cabin like a snake. "You've led me on a hell of a chase, sweetheart. I gotta admit, this is a beautiful spot to die. Send the ledger and the cash out the front door, and I'll make sure Mr. Pendleton lets your mountain man live. Keep it, and we burn you both out like rats." Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, a whimper catching in her throat. Caleb didn't move a muscle. He slowly adjusted the rear sight of the Sharp's buffalo rifle. "Don't answer," Caleb whispered. "They're trying to pinpoint where we are in the room." "I'm losing my patience, Josie," Briggs yelled. Suddenly the night erupted. A volley of rifle fire tore from the tree line. Bullets slammed into the heavy log walls of the cabin with deafening thuds, splintering wood and shattering the clay chinking. Josephine screamed, throwing her hands over her ears, as a stray round punched through a window shutter and buried itself in the ceiling. Caleb didn't flinch. He peered through the slit, his eyes adjusted to the dark. He saw the muzzle flashes in the trees. He exhaled a long, slow breath, aimed at the center of the brightest flash, and squeezed the trigger. The Sharp's rifle roared like a cannon, a concussive blast that shook the cabin walls. A man screamed in the darkness outside, a wet, gurgling sound that was abruptly cut short. "One down," Caleb muttered calmly. Reloading, he cracked the breech, the smoking brass casing flying out to hit the floorboards. Josephine scrambled up on her knees, her hands trembling, as she shoved a massive .50-90 cartridge into the chamber. Caleb slammed it shut. The return fire intensified. The men outside were no longer trying to intimidate. They were trying to kill. Lead rained against the cabin. Caleb fired again, then swapped to the Winchester that Josephine handed him. He moved from window to window, firing rapidly, creating the illusion that there were half a dozen men inside defending the property. "Miller!" Briggs's voice screamed from the dark, laced with sudden panic. "Flank the back, burn the roof. They're moving to the lean-to," Caleb shouted over the gunfire. He sprinted to the back of the cabin, but as he crossed the room, a heavy slug from a Spencer repeating rifle tore through the wooden doorframe. The bullet grazed Caleb's ribcage, tearing through his canvas duster and carving a bloody trench along his side. He grunted, stumbling backward and dropping the Winchester to the floor. "Caleb!" Josephine shrieked. She crawled across the floorboards, her hands instantly coming away, slick with his blood. "I'm fine. It's just a graze," Caleb rasped, clutching his side. He tried to reach for the dropped rifle, but his arm gave out from the shock of the impact. "The back window. Josie. He's going to throw a torch." Josephine looked at the back window. Through the slit, she could see the flickering orange glow of a pitch pine torch being lit. A man's silhouette appeared, winding his arm back to hurl the fire onto the dry cedar shingles of their roof. She didn't think. The terrified bookkeeper from Chicago vanished. She grabbed the heavy Winchester from the floor, hauled herself up to the gun slit, shoved the barrel through, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked like a mule, slamming hard into her shoulder. But the shot rang true. The man outside dropped the torch, clutching his chest, and fell backward into the dirt. The torch landed harmlessly in the damp mud. Josephine racked the lever, chambering another round her breathing, heavy, her eyes wild. She looked down at Caleb, who was staring up at her with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "I got him." She breathed the smell of sulfur and burnt powder filling her nose. Caleb pushed himself up against the wall, a grim, bloody smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Remind me never to lie to you about plowing fields, Josephine." But the victory was short-lived. A massive crash shook the front of the cabin. Briggs hadn't flanked them. He had used the distraction to bring a heavy logging axe to the front door. The thick oak splintered the iron hinges, groaning under the assault. The siege was breaching. The front door splintered with a deafening crack as the logging axe finally shattered the heavy iron latch. Cold mountain wind roared through the breach, fanning the flames that had already begun to lick the cedar shingles of the roof. "Down the hatch," Caleb shouted, clutching his bleeding side. He shoved the heavy velvet bag containing the money and the ledger toward Josephine. The root cellar now. Josephine threw the bag down the trapdoor, grabbed the Winchester rifle, and scrambled down the wooden ladder into the pitch-black, freezing earth. Caleb followed, dragging the heavy rug and floorboards shut just as the front door gave way completely. Above them, heavy boots stomped across the floor. "Find them," Clayton Briggs's voice barked, muffled by the thick wood. "Check the crawl spaces. Burn them out if you have to." In the suffocating darkness, Caleb grabbed Josephine's hand. "I dug a drainage tunnel when I built this place. Leads out behind the corral. Keep low and stay quiet." They crawled through the damp earth, the smell of soil and smoke filling their lungs. They pushed through a camouflage of dried brush at the tunnel's end, spilling out into the frigid night air, 50 yards behind the cabin, concealed by a grove of snow-dusted spruce. They looked back. The roof of the cabin was fully engulfed, a beacon of fire against the starlit Bitterroot sky. The only place Josephine had ever truly felt safe was turning to ash. "Stay here," Caleb breathed, pressing the velvet bag into her chest. He pulled his Colt revolver. "Briggs will realize we aren't inside. I'm going to circle around." Before Josephine could protest, Caleb vanished into the dark timber. The minutes stretched into agony. Then 2 muffled pops echoed from the corral. Caleb's revolvers. A moment later, a heavy boot snapped a branch right behind her. Josephine whipped around, raising the rifle, but a gloved hand struck the barrel, knocking it into the snow. Clayton Briggs stepped from the shadows, a vicious grin splitting his face, his revolver aimed directly at her chest. "The little bird flew the coop," Briggs sneered. "Hand over the bag, Miss Cartwright. I'll make it quick." Josephine's heart hammered, but her hands were steady. She gripped the velvet handles of the bag. "Pendleton will never get away with this. The ledger proves everything." "Pendleton owns the law," Briggs laughed. "That book is just kindling." As Briggs reached for the bag, Josephine swung it with all her might. The thick bricks of cash and the heavy leather-bound ledger smashed directly into Briggs's face. Briggs howled, stumbling backward, his gun discharging wildly into the dirt. Before he could recover, a massive shadow launched from the trees. Caleb hit Briggs like a runaway freight train. Both men crashed into the snow. Briggs was vicious, driving a knee into Caleb's wounded side and pulling a heavy Bowie knife. The blade flashed in the firelight inches from Caleb's throat. Caleb was losing blood, his strength fading fast. Josephine scrambled through the snow, digging frantically until her fingers wrapped around the icy barrel of her Winchester. She couldn't risk a shot in the chaotic grapple. "Caleb!" she screamed. With a final agonizing surge of strength, Caleb twisted, throwing Briggs off balance. Josephine stepped forward and slammed the heavy wooden stock of the rifle directly into the back of Briggs's skull. Briggs collapsed face first into the snow. Caleb lay gasping, the snow beneath him staining crimson. Josephine fell to her knees, pressing her hands against his bleeding side, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't shoot him," Caleb rasped, a faint smile touching his lips. "I didn't want to ruin a good rifle," she sobbed. They bound Briggs and survived the night in the lean-to. When dawn broke, they loaded their surviving mules. They didn't ride to Missoula. They rode north to Helena, straight to the private residence of United States District Judge Hiram Knowles, a man renowned for his unyielding hatred of railroad corruption. In the judge's study, Josephine placed the blood-stained ledger and $50,000 on the mahogany desk. "My name is Josephine Cartwright. I have evidence of mass murder orchestrated by Arthur Pendleton, and that man outside is his lead executioner." Judge Knowles scanned the red-inked pages, his face hardening into granite. "If this goes to trial, you will be a target for the rest of your life." Caleb stepped forward, his hand on his Colt. "Let him reach. He'll find out what happens when he touches my wife." The trial shattered Pendleton's empire overnight. Briggs was sentenced to hang. The railroad expansion was halted indefinitely. 6 months later, spring had arrived in the high country. Where the charred ruins had stood, a new cabin was being built. Fresh golden pine logs smelled of sap and promise. Caleb was on the roof, hammering shingles. He paused, looking down at the clearing. Josephine stood by the corral in practical denim, laughing as she fed a new chestnut mare. The terrified fugitive was gone, replaced by a fierce woman of the mountains. She caught him looking and smiled, a radiant sight that outshone the sun. Caleb climbed down the ladder, walking over to brush a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. "I was thinking," he murmured. "I owe that agency in St. Louis a letter of complaint. They promised me a simple bride, someone to mend a fence and stay out of trouble. And instead," Josephine whispered, her breath mingling with his. "Instead," Caleb smiled, capturing her lips in a deep kiss. "They delivered the only storm I ever wanted to get caught in." If you felt the chill of the bitterroot wind and the heat of Caleb and Josephine's desperate fight for survival, do not leave this valley just yet. The American frontier is packed with untold stories of raw grit, unexpected romance, and ruthless outlaws who finally meet their match. Hit that like button if you loved seeing Josephine find her courage and fight back, and share this incredible journey with anyone who craves a truly gritty historical romance drama. Every interaction from you helps us bring more authentic frontier legends to life on this channel. Do not forget to hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling tale of danger and passion out here in the Wild West. We love reading your thoughts on these Wild West survival stories, so drop a comment below with your favorite moment from Caleb and Josephine's incredible mountain showdown.